Horror games continue to be a dime a dozen these days, but very few franchises have managed to stay relevant as long as Resident Evil has. With well over 2 decades worth of games and more than a dozen entries, Resident Evil continues to be a powerhouse that's still pumping out quality survival horror games every year or so, while also making active efforts to placate its rich history to a modern audience through remakes. With such a diverse history, it's only natural that Resident Evil would have a couple of offshoots, both successful and unsuccessful, of course. And one of them has to be Resident Evil Outbreak, which garnered just enough critical and commercial success to warrant a sequel. Outbreak 2 was released in 2005 for the PS2 and didn't fare well in terms of critical and commercial reception. And that got us thinking, how would Resident Evil Outbreak 2 rank in the modern gaming hemisphere? Will players resonate with these ideas, or will it continue to wail away in mediocrity to this date? Well, with this feature, we're going to do just that as we try to score Resident Evil Outbreak 2 in 2026, and try to assign a final review score to this game without taking into consideration its historical importance or nostalgic connection. Much like what came before, Resident Evil Outbreak 2 revolves around the same scenario-based survival loop as the original. You're dropped into a self-contained disaster scenario somewhere in the familiar yet terrifying Raccoon City, and you need to gather resources, solve environmental puzzles, avoid or manage combat encounters, and attempt to escape before the risk of infection escalates or enemies start to overwhelm you. Unmistakably, this is a slow game at its core. You're going to find yourself constantly scanning rooms for items, listening for audio cues that signal danger, and weighing whether it's worth engaging with enemies at all. The gameplay loop still works remarkably well today, and it's also refreshing to some extent, especially for players tired of horror games that lean too heavily into action. Resident Evil Outbreak 2 doubles down on this sense of fragility, the constant reminder that everything can go wrong pretty quickly, and this remains one of the game's strongest qualities. What continues to shine is how this gameplay loop feeds into the co-op mode. Playing solo is okay, but the game is clearly designed around multiple players sharing the burden of survival. Resources are scarce enough that hoarding becomes a liability and reckless behavior is punished swiftly. Every action feels communal, whether that's unlocking a door that benefits the group or wasting ammunition that everyone might need later. We've seen action-oriented co-op horror games like Left 4 Dead where players find the beauty of cooperation amidst the chaos. But Resident Evil Outbreak 2's approach to teamwork is about being prepared and making decisions together. And there aren't many games that tackle this element of shared responsibility this efficiently. The constant feeling of tension doesn't come from enemies alone, but from the knowledge that one poor decision can doom the entire team. Resident Evil Outbreak 2 is built from the same DNA as its predecessor, so the tank-style controls return, which can be off-putting to modern players at first. Add to that fixed camera angles, and there's no getting around the fact that this design choice introduces friction. But it's not all bad either. Movement ends up being deliberate rather than fluid. Aiming requires patience, and camera angles often obscure threats until it's too late. The lack of immediate responsiveness reinforces a sense of vulnerability, making every encounter feel riskier than it would with modern controls. It's still a silver lining though. These controls do take a bit to get used to, and many newcomers would feel almost alien to them and would most likely give up on them. Inventory management also suffers from the same aging problems, as navigating item screens can be painfully slow. Combining or trading items takes effort, and there's little in the way of quality of life conveniences. These elements add to tension, but they can also interrupt pacing, especially for players accustomed to streamlined interfaces. The game's user interface is barely adequate when it comes to showcasing information, and these elements can culminate to a pain point to the overall experience. But it's not all bad either. Outbreak 2 also has plenty of merits to its name. For starters, there's no traditional progression system, no skill trees or stat upgrades, and mastery comes from understanding characters, scenarios, and systems. Each playable civilian has subtle strengths and weaknesses that influence how they contribute to a team, and learning to leverage those traits is crucial. Combat remains intentionally limited, Weapons are unreliable, ammo is scarce, and enemies are best avoided when possible. This keeps pacing slow, but it also means repetition can set in over long sessions. Once you understand optimal strategies for certain scenarios, some of the mystery dissipates, and the game's risks become more procedural than frightening. Level and mission design is another aspect where Outbreak 2 isn't as great as its predecessor. Scenarios are more varied than in the original, with a stronger emphasis on environmental hazards, multi-step objectives, and branching paths. Backtracking is frequent, but it rarely becomes bothering. Figuring out what you need to do can be cumbersome since objectives are not always clearly communicated and clues are quite scarce. Compared to modern games, this lack of clarity feels less like an intentional design choice and more like a piece of outdated design. Checkpoints are sparse, and failure can mean replaying large chunks of content, which can be a frustrating affair. Visually, the game is unmistakably a product of the PlayStation 2 era, but it hasn't aged as poorly as raw fidelity alone would suggest. Pre-rendered backgrounds and fixed camera angles allow for carefully composed scenes that still hold up surprisingly well to this date. Character models are stiff, animations are limited, and textures are muddy by modern standards, but the overall art direction helps in covering up those flaws. All in all, the game still communicates its moods in a rather convincing fashion, even if it's no longer impressing on a technical level. Audio designs fare slightly better with age. The soundscape remains effective, with ambient noises, distant groans, and sudden audio spikes keeping players on edge. Much like Outbreak, background music is used sparingly, which gives way to silence and heightens anxiety. Voice acting is uneven, which shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone who has played a Resident Evil game before. Some performances sell panic and desperation well, while others veer into the awkward territory, but that's not really a big issue in the grand scheme of all things. Crucially, sound cues still function as an essential gameplay tool, alerting players to off-screen threats in an organic manner. Switching gears to the story, Outbreak 2 shares its predecessor's grounded approach to storytelling. The premise is simple: ordinary people trying to survive extraordinary circumstances during Raccoon City's collapse. Characters are quite shallow, with not a lot going on in terms of personal development, but that choice works well in the game's favor. The focus is on situation rather than personality, on survival rather than the drama. Pacing can be quite uneven, with some scenarios feeling narratively thin while others feeling stretched out. But the overarching theme of helplessness in the face of systemic failures still resonates through and through. In terms of content completeness, Outbreak 2 offers a substantial amount to engage with, even without modern expansions or DLC. Multiple scenarios, difficulty variations, and character combinations provide replay value, though much of that value hinges on co-op play. Some scenarios are clearly stronger than others, and not all are essential, but taken as a whole, the package feels reasonably complete. Now, when compared to modern co-op contemporaries, Outbreak 2 feels both dated and oddly timeless. In controls, interface, and technical limitations, they're undeniably a product of its era. But some elements of its core philosophy, such as shared vulnerability or refusal to give a power fantasy, remains compelling. Many contemporary titles chase spectacle or accessibility at the expense of depth, but Outbreak 2 sticks to the formula and rarely pulls out. In 2026, Resident Evil Outbreak 2 is not a hidden masterpiece, but it is far from mediocrity. It's a flawed but ambitious survival horror experience that rewards patience, cooperation, and a willingness to engage with old-school design. Players seeking smooth controls, cinematic storytelling, or solo-friendly progression may want to look elsewhere. But those who are instead interested in the concept of it all and willing to accept rough edges will find plenty to appreciate here. If we had to assign a score to this game in 2026, I would give it a 7 out of 10 for its rights and its wrongs.
And that'll be about it for this one. If you guys like what we're doing at GamingBolt, please consider subscribing to our channel, and I'll see you guys on the next video.